Thomas Jefferson believed his family came from Welsh nobility near Mount Snowdon, but no one could prove it, and DNA would later point somewhere far older and far stranger. For most of his life, Thomas Jefferson believed something very specific about where his family came from. Not just Britain, not just Wales, something grander than that. He believed the Jeffersons descended from Welsh nobility living near Mount Snowdon, one of the most famous landscapes in Wales, a place that already sounded ancient, noble, and half-legendary before anyone even opened a family record. And that detail matters, because this was not just a casual guess about ancestry. It was a family story with status, a story with elevation, a story that placed the Jefferson line inside an older world of landed memory, bloodline, and prestige. In other words, it was exactly the kind of origin story families like to keep, and Jefferson kept it. That is one of the first strange things about this story. Thomas Jefferson is remembered as a man of inquiry, a man of letters, a man obsessed with classification, architecture, books, plants, language, history, and evidence. He collected, compared, measured, and documented. He was not someone you naturally associate with untested legend, but like many people, even very rational people, he seems to have made room for one inherited story that felt true because it had been passed down long enough. That is where this mystery begins, not with a lab, not with a chromosome, but with a family tradition that sounded believable, flattering, and old. And for generations, that was often enough. The problem is, once historians started looking for the trail behind that claim, the story began to thin out. The closer you get to prestigious family legends, the more often they start to behave like smoke. They are vivid from a distance. Up close, they can be hard to hold. That does not mean every family tradition is false. Some turn out to be accurate. Some are partly accurate. Some preserve the shape of a truth even when the details drift. But noble origin stories are especially slippery because they tend to improve over time. A family does not usually retell its past in a way that makes itself sound smaller. It rounds upward, it polishes, it upgrades. And that is important here because the Jefferson story had exactly the kind of polish you would expect from an ancestry tale that had survived by being repeated, not by being proven. Mount Snowdon, Welsh nobility, an old world line behind a new world family. It is elegant, almost too elegant, and that should make us pause. Because once you ask the obvious question, what records actually prove this, the ground gets less solid. Where are the documents? Where is the chain? Where is the paper trail connecting that noble Welsh image to the Jefferson family we can actually place in history? That is where the story starts to wobble. The traditional claim had force as memory. It had force as identity. But memory and identity are not the same thing as evidence. And those three things, memory, identity, evidence, are about to collide in a way Jefferson himself never could have anticipated. Before we get there, though, it helps to understand why a story like this could last so long. In early American families, especially ones that rose into prominence, ancestry was never just about curiosity. It was about legitimacy. It was about explaining who you were by attaching yourself to something older, sturdier, and more prestigious than the unstable present. A family that could say it came from noble stock was not just telling a story about the past. It was making a claim in the present. This is who we are. This is where we come from. This is why we matter. And once a family begins to believe that kind of story, the story starts doing work. It gets repeated at tables, in letters, across generations. Eventually, it stops sounding like a theory and starts sounding like background truth. That may be what happened here. Jefferson did not need the story to invent himself, but it fit. It fit the era. It fit the family. It fit the long human habit of arranging the past into something coherent and honorable. There is just one problem. History does not care what fits. And when historians tried to verify this elegant Welsh origin, they ran into a silence that was hard to ignore. The story remained famous. The proof did not. That is the hinge of the entire video. Because once paper records fail, the question changes. It is no longer, was the story impressive? It becomes, was it true? And once that question is asked seriously, the Jefferson legend moves out of the world of family memory and into something much more dangerous for old myths: testing. The kind that does not care how long a story has been told. The kind that can compare one male line to another and ask a brutally simple question: if the Jeffersons really came from that old Welsh line, should their signatures still be visible? That was the moment this stopped being a family legend and became an investigation. And the result was not what anyone expected. So now the story has a problem. The records did not cleanly confirm the Welsh noble claim. The family legend still existed, still sounded impressive, still carried emotional weight. But the documentary trail was weak enough that another kind of evidence started to matter more. That is where genetics entered. And this is the point where a lot of ancestry stories become confusing, because DNA can sound more magical than it really is. So before the twist lands, we need one simple idea. On the direct male line, fathers pass a Y chromosome to sons. Not all DNA, just that one paternal line. Over many generations, that line changes slowly enough that researchers can compare one male line to another and ask whether they likely share a common paternal ancestor. That does not reconstruct an entire family tree. It does not tell you everything about a person's ancestry. It does not replace history. But in a case like this, it can test a very specific claim. If Thomas Jefferson's direct male line really came from the same old British Jefferson stock the family story implied, then somewhere in Britain, among men carrying the Jefferson surname, you would expect to find matching Y chromosome signatures. That is the logic. It is simple, it is elegant, and it is dangerous to old myths. Because once you can test the direct paternal line, the story no longer depends only on what families said. It depends on whether living descendants still carry the same genetic signal. So researchers took that idea seriously. At the University of Leicester, geneticists looked at the Jefferson surname in Britain through exactly this lens. The setup alone sounds promising for the family legend. Britain is where the old line should still echo most clearly. And if the Jeffersons truly came from a known Welsh-rooted paternal line, a broader network test ought to reveal that pattern. This is where the audience expects confirmation. Maybe not perfect confirmation. Maybe not a neat medieval scroll tying everything together, but at least a strong cluster. At least a decent number of British Jefferson men sharing the president's male line signature. That would be the expected shape of the story. Instead, the test produced something far stranger. Researchers examined 85 British men with the surname Jefferson. 85. That is not a tiny anecdotal sample. It is large enough to make the next number hit hard. Only 2 match the exact Y chromosome signature of Jefferson's direct male line. 2. That is the moment the family myth starts to come apart in public. Because this was not a case where the Welsh cluster appeared faintly, or where the evidence mostly supported the old claim with a few loose ends. The pattern was much more disruptive than that. If a broad British Jefferson network barely matched the presidential line at all, then the long-assumed ancestry story was no longer standing on shaky ground. It was standing on almost nothing. And then came the second blow. The 2 matching men were not from Wales, not from the shadow of Mount Snowdon, not from the noble landscape at the center of the family tradition, not from the place the story had trained everyone to expect. They were from Yorkshire and the English Midlands. That shift is easy to miss if you hear it too quickly, but it changes the entire map of the story, because now the problem is no longer just that the Welsh noble claim lacks paperwork. Now the best genetic matches point away from Wales altogether. The evidence is not merely incomplete, it is directional. It is starting to suggest a different British context entirely. And that should raise a deeper question. How does a family spend generations repeating one origin story, only for a direct male line test to point somewhere else? There are a few possibilities. Family legends can drift, names can travel, branches can split, status stories can attach themselves to a surname later, and in any long paternal line there can be breaks between the story people inherit and the biological line actually passed from father to son. That last possibility is especially important because surnames and Y chromosomes often travel together, but not always perfectly. Over centuries, adoptions, informal name changes, non-paternity events, remarriages, inheritance choices, and local naming habits can bend the story away from the biology. So the Leicester result did not give a fairy tale answer. It gave a forensic one. It said, in effect, whatever the Jefferson family believed about noble Welsh origins, the direct paternal line associated with Thomas Jefferson does not line up cleanly with a broad Welsh Jefferson pattern. In fact, it barely lines up with British Jeffersons at all. That is a devastating result for a prestige myth, but it is also the beginning of a better mystery, because once the audience absorbs the first reversal, another one arrives almost immediately. The strangest part of the study was not just the low match count. It was not even the move away from Wales. The strangest part was the lineage itself, because when researchers looked at the deeper paternal signature carried by Jefferson's line, they found something exceptionally rare in Europe, something that made the whole story much bigger than a choice between Wales and England. At that point, this stopped being just a British surname puzzle. It became a deep ancestry puzzle, and that is where the Jefferson story turns from a damaged family legend into something far more surprising. By this point, the Welsh story is already in trouble. The paper trail did not secure it. The Leicester network did not rescue it. Out of 85 British Jefferson men, only 2 matched Thomas Jefferson's direct male line, and neither of those lines pointed back to Wales. That alone would have been enough to rewrite the family legend. But then, the deeper result came into focus. And this is where the story becomes much stranger than most viewers expect. Because the real surprise was not simply that Jefferson's paternal line looked less Welsh than his family believed. The real surprise was the type of paternal line it turned out to be. Jefferson's direct male lineage belongs to haplogroup T. That term can sound technical, so let's strip it down immediately. A haplogroup is basically a very old branch on the human paternal tree. If you trace the Y chromosome back far enough, different male lines split off from one another over thousands and thousands of years. Those deep branches are what geneticists call haplogroups. So when we say Jefferson belonged to haplogroup T, we are not talking about his politics, culture, language, or even his complete ancestry. We're talking about one very old paternal branch, one line, father to son, back and back and back. And that single line is unusual, very unusual. Haplogroup T is rare in Europe. In most of Europe, it appears only in a small fraction of men, which means Jefferson's paternal signature was not just inconsistent with the specific Welsh noble story, it was also uncommon in the wider European population. That matters because it changes the emotional shape of the reveal. If the result had simply come back as a very common British or Northwestern European lineage, then the story would still be interesting, but more ordinary. It would sound like a family that exaggerated its Welsh roots and turned out to be more broadly English or British than expected. Instead, the line was rare enough to force a bigger question. Not just were the Jeffersons wrong about Wales, but what exactly was this paternal line doing in the Jefferson family at all? That is the point where the story expands, because haplogroup T reaches much farther back than any noble genealogy, much farther back than surnames, farther back than medieval Wales, farther back than Britain as a cultural idea. We are now in the territory of deep ancestry, where the line is tracked not in family legends, but in prehistoric human migration. And in that deeper frame, haplogroup T is associated with ancient origins in the Near East. Again, this needs careful wording. That does not mean Thomas Jefferson was Near Eastern in any modern national sense. It does not mean his whole ancestry came from one place. It does not mean his recent family was culturally Middle Eastern. None of that follows from a Y chromosome haplogroup. What it does mean is that if you follow one paternal branch deep enough into prehistory, Jefferson's line appears to connect to a very old population history, centered far to the east of the Welsh landscape his family imagined. That is a stunning reversal. Mount Snowdon on one side, the ancient Near East on the other. One is a family legend tied to status and place. The other is a genetic signal tied to migration and time. and those are not the same kind of story at all. This is also why the Jefferson case is so powerful as a piece of storytelling. The DNA does not merely replace one neat national label with another. It replaces a polished ancestral identity with a much deeper, messier human past. A past tied to movement. A past tied to survival. A past tied to populations who lived so long before Jefferson that the usual categories of family history barely apply. In broad terms, haplogroup T has been associated with lineages connected to the ancient Near East and to populations involved in some of the earliest agricultural worlds. In popular language, that is where the story becomes irresistible, because suddenly, the direct male line of an American president is no longer being compared to Welsh nobles. It is being placed at the deepest level of paternal origin in a story that reaches back toward the Fertile Crescent and the earliest farming societies. That leap is dramatic, but it has to be handled responsibly. The DNA does not tell us the names of Jefferson's prehistoric ancestors. It does not draw a perfect map of every generation. It does not let us say, with cinematic certainty, exactly how each branch moved from one region to another. What it does give us is something both narrower and more powerful. It tells us that the paternal line Jefferson inherited belonged to a deep branch that is rare in Europe and older than the family legend by tens of thousands of years. That is the second collapse in this story. First, the Welsh noble claim stops holding. Then, even the idea of a simple, local British origin starts to feel too small, because now the audience is left with the most interesting question yet. If Jefferson's direct male line belongs to a rare haplogroup with deep roots in the ancient Near East, how did that line end up in Britain in the first place? That is where the mystery shifts again. No longer from legend to test. No longer from Wales to England. Now it moves from genealogy into migration, from surnames into prehistory, and from one family's memory into the long, restless movement of human lines across continents. And once you see that, the old Jefferson story does not just look wrong, it looks tiny. So now we have the most important question in the entire story. If Thomas Jefferson's direct male line belongs to a rare haplogroup with deep roots in the ancient Near East, how did that line end up in Britain at all? Because this is where a lot of ancestry stories go off the rails. A dramatic DNA result arrives and people rush to turn it into a modern identity label. They flatten thousands of years into a headline. They take one paternal line and treat it as if it explains the whole person. But that is not how this works. And in the Jefferson case, getting this part right is what makes the story more credible, not less interesting. The first thing to understand is that deep ancestry is not the same thing as recent ancestry. Those sound similar, but they are doing very different jobs. Recent ancestry is the world of grandparents, surnames, records, villages, migrations you can often date, and family stories people still remember. Deep ancestry is much older. It tracks lines so ancient that they belong to prehistoric population movements, not personal memory. And Jefferson's Y chromosome result lives in that second category. It is not telling us that a recent Jefferson ancestor stepped directly out of the ancient Near East into colonial America. It is telling us that the paternal line, if traced back far enough, belongs to a branch whose deepest origin lies there. That branch could have moved, mixed, and resettled many times over thousands of years before the Jefferson surname ever existed. That distinction matters because it is the bridge between the science and the history. A Y line can begin in one region and appear much later in another because human populations do not stay still. They migrate, they intermarry, they fragment, they reform, they move through trade, conquest, settlement, collapse, survival, and chance. A lineage can travel without carrying its original language. It can survive while losing its original culture. It can remain biologically continuous while becoming socially unrecognizable. That is the real power of this story. The Jefferson family legend imagined ancestry as a neat inheritance from a noble place. DNA replaces that with something older and less tidy, a paternal line that may have passed through many worlds before it ever entered Britain. So how could that happen? In the broadest sense, through the same mechanism that shaped most of Eurasian history, repeated waves of human movement over very long periods of time. Populations associated with ancient Near Eastern lineages spread, mixed with others, and over millennia left descendants across multiple regions. By the time you reach historical Britain, what you are seeing is not a single migration event with a label attached. You are seeing the final visible point of a line that has already lived many previous lives. That is why the Jefferson result is both revealing and incomplete. It reveals the deep branch. It does not narrate every step in between. And that uncertainty is not a flaw. It is part of the truth, because family legends usually pretend the past is cleaner than it was. Genetics often does the opposite. It shows you just enough to make the old story collapse, but not enough to replace it with a fairy tale. That is exactly what happened here. The Welsh noble claim offered certainty without proof. The Y chromosome offers evidence without total certainty. And evidence without total certainty is still much stronger. There is another clarification that matters here too. When we talk about Jefferson's paternal line, we are talking about one line out of many, just one. Go back 10 generations and a person has a huge number of ancestors. The Y chromosome follows only one narrow path through that larger tree. So the DNA result does not mean Jefferson's ancestry as a whole can be reduced to haplogroup T. Not even close. It means one specific male line. The line is family attached to the Jefferson name, appears to have a deep origin far older and farther east than the family tradition claimed. That is the line the myth got wrong, and there's something almost poetic about that. The very line the family used to anchor its most prestigious story turned out to be the least compatible with the story itself, not because it was less interesting, because it was more interesting. The old version said, "We come from noble stock near Mount Snowdon." The newer version says the direct male line behind the Jefferson name was part of a much older human journey, one that cannot be contained by a single medieval landscape or a flattering family memory. That is a much harder story to tell at a dinner table, but it is a much bigger story, and it also helps explain why the Leicester results looked so odd. If Jefferson's Y line was already unusual within Britain, then it makes sense that a broad surname search would find very few exact matches. The rarity was not just a footnote, it was part of the explanation. This was never likely to look like a common, densely clustered Welsh surname pattern, which leaves us with a final question. Once the Welsh myth collapses, and once the deep ancestry result is understood properly, what are we actually supposed to conclude? Was Jefferson simply wrong? Was the family lying? Or is the more revealing answer that family memory, paper records, and DNA are each telling different parts of the same human problem? Our need to know where we come from and how often we get that story wrong. That is where the Jefferson mystery ends. Not with one neat replacement myth, but with a sharper understanding of what ancestry can and cannot really tell us. So what did Thomas Jefferson's DNA actually change? One very important thing. It broke the family's old claim that the Jefferson paternal line came from Welsh nobility near Mount Snowdon. The records never firmly proved it, and the Y chromosome evidence did not support it. On the direct male line, the story simply does not hold. And that is what makes this case so fascinating, because the replacement was not a cleaner legend. It was a stranger truth. Instead of confirming a prestigious Welsh origin, the evidence pointed to a rare paternal lineage with far deeper roots, one that pushes the story far beyond the family myth Jefferson inherited. That does not explain all of Jefferson's ancestry. It explains one line, but it was the line carrying the Jefferson name and the very line the family built its story around. So in the end, this is not just a story about Thomas Jefferson being wrong. It is a story about how family memory can preserve identity long after it stops preserving fact. Jefferson thought his family came from Welsh nobility. His DNA told a different story. And somehow, the real one was even bigger.